Hey everyone, welcome back to Mind Keys. Super good to have you here. So today's video is on the topic of CPTSD, or complex post-traumatic stress disorder, and psychedelics, and whether or not we can use psychedelics to clear CPTSD from the body or resolve it. This is something that I think is really timely and really important to be talking about, and it kind of just came up out of the blue, so I thought I would make a video about it, and that's what you'll be watching here in just a moment. I do want to say really quick, this is a personal one for me in that I have a lot of personal experience because I have had CPTSD the majority of my life. Didn't know it till about 5 or 6 years ago when I started to discover the language for understanding what this is, and then started to work on it actively myself. Before that, for about 25 years previous to that, I had been using psychedelics to try to clear the CPTSD symptoms from me, but I didn't know that that's what it was I was trying to do. So this is something I have a lot of personal firsthand experience with. It's also something that I've seen a lot of other people in my community around me trying to address in their own way with psychedelics as well. So it's something that I think is very common in the psychedelic community, that people are trying to clear trauma from the body, trauma from the mind, using psychedelics. And I wanted to offer you my own 2 cents on it based on all that firsthand experience and all that observational experience. So that's what you're going to be watching here. I hope you get some value out of it. If you're someone with CPTSD and you're either thinking about using psychedelics to try to resolve it and clear it, or you're already using psychedelics to try to clear it, hopefully this will be of some sort of orienting, clarifying value for you. If you like this video, if it's in some way, helpful to you, you know what to do in terms of liking, thumbs up, subscribing, commenting, interacting, all that good stuff. So I hope you enjoy it. I hope you get something out of it, and let's go ahead and get into it. Okay, so today's topic is something that I wasn't planning on making. This is kind of off the cuff here a little bit, but since it's fresh in my mind, I just had responded on a thread on Reddit about this, where someone was asking. Someone had brought up the point that basically what they had said is, well, I've used a few high doses to small doses of psychedelics, and it didn't help my CPTSD. And I replied to that with my own take on that as to why that would be, that they would, have done psychedelics and still have not gotten the results. So I wanted to go ahead and just expand upon that here, explain my own experience, what I've seen happen as a part of the psychedelic community for, over 20 years at this point. And share with you why I think, it works the way it works. So my spicy take, my kind of like zinger of a one-liner here, if I was going to be like clickbaity about it, is no, I do not think that psychedelics alone, in and of themselves, by themselves, will resolve CPTSD. One of the unfortunate things that I've seen happen as the popularity and the interest in psychedelics is growing right now, and there's all this kind of enthusiasm about the science and the way it can revolutionize mental health and improve our quality of life, and improve, healing, speed up healing, which I think is all valid, factual, and true. One of the downsides is we have a lot of people who are getting kind of partial information that turns into kind of a distorted sense of what's real and what's not. Which is essentially the same as misinformation that happens, in the kind of hollow mirrors we call social media, right? So we have people who have misunderstandings about what psychedelics realistically can and can't do, and can and can't help you with. And one of those is kind of this assumption, or this idea that just taking psychedelics alone will resolve depression, will resolve anxiety, will resolve whatever, issue you might be struggling with. And in my own experience, that's just simply not the case. I wish it were, because I've done plenty of them, kind of knocking on that door, hoping that that would be the case, even unconsciously before I knew that that's why I was taking them. But the reality is, I don't think that psychedelics alone, out of the hundreds and hundreds of experiences I've had, they don't really, in and of themselves, by themselves, resolve CPTSD. So I want to make that point really clear. So if that's what you're expecting, then you're going to have experience like the person on Reddit who commented did, where you're going to be like, well, look, I've done them, I've taken them. Maybe I had a great experience, maybe I didn't, maybe I had a weird experience. I'm not any, better for it. I'm not any wiser for the wear, so to speak. And so I want to explain to you, how they can help, and also if you want to apply psychedelics to your CPTSD, if this is something you feel safe with, you feel called to, maybe you're a psychonaut anyways, or maybe you feel like they give you some sort of a release and you have a sense that they really can take you that full way, but you don't know how yet. I want to explain how that might be possible and, what I've seen happen. So let me go ahead and just kind of fill this in a little bit. So one of the ways that they can help you is that, one of the things that we know from the science of psychedelics is that they switch off the default mode network, right? So the default mode network is the part of the brain, it's a network of different regions that kind of create this sense of like our normal everyday waking consciousness. And one of the features of the default mode network is the kind of self-reflection, the self-awareness, the self-rumination that we get stuck in, especially when we've been traumatized. So if you're someone who goes into, self-reflecting too much, into thinking about yourself, into self-criticizing, into any of that kind of stuff, these internal thought loops where you're kind of ruminating over and over and over, that's the default mode network at play, right? So one of the things that psychedelics does is it switches off the default mode network, which is awesome. And then one of the benefits of that is that when you come down off the psychedelic and it switches back into your normal default mode network, it's much more balanced, shall we say. So instead of being hyperactive or on hyperdrive where it's constantly ruminating and constantly self-reflecting and you're feeling maybe overly self-conscious or you're stuck in these thought loops about the past and, over-processing, as is kind of a classic signpost of anxiety, depression, things like that. What you find is that after you've kind of come down off the psychedelic, and this is part of that afterglow, is that your brain is kind of like tonified or more balanced, if you will, where your default mode network is working, but it's more balanced. So that's one of the ways it can help you, is that it can start to calm the ruminations by helping you to balance out your default mode network. One of the other things it can do to help is when you're high on the psychedelic, if you've taken enough of a dose, I'm sure we've all had that experience of kind of stepping outside of our normal experience of reality. And it's almost like you can look at it objectively, if you will, or from a disconnected, kind of observer point of view. And you can look at maybe some absurdity of something you've kind of internalized or you've been feeling or believing, or some sort of nonsense that you're operating on, that all of a sudden you go, what am I thinking? That's ridiculous. Like, really? Is that really what I believe? Or is that really how I want to live? Or is that really how I want to be? So that kind of, space from being stuck inside of your issues and your ruminations and your problems or memories or whatever it is that might be vexing you, if you can get that spaciousness, that's another way that psychedelics can start to help you then look at these problems and these, points of view from another point of view, and give you maybe, a way of reframing that, a way of kind of recontextualizing what it is that you've been operating on as an assumption, and really kind of reviewing that and reflecting on that and being like, is that how I want to feel? Is that how I want to live? Is that how I want to be? So that's another way that they can really help. And what I've been finding, and this is really kind of my area of exploration right now, is that I also think that psychedelics can be used as a way to kind of leverage some neuroplasticity, to kind of increase your openness and increase that fluidity for a little while of the brain, where you can really go in and kind of really, proactively rewire some things and really kind of get in there and, move the pieces into the right place and clean up the things that need cleaning up kind of a bit more effectively, because there's maybe less resistance or less rigidity, if you will. So I think those are all ways that they can help, but I don't think, so in other words, just to be clear on that last point, psychedelics plus some sort of a therapeutic intervention probably work really well. And that's been my experience. So whether that is doing a psychedelic in and of itself just to get that different vantage point, and then doing therapy after the fact, or hypnotherapy in my case, or, NLP or coaching or some sort of, practice to kind of, turn those insights into actual transformation. The other way you could go, obviously, is doing, some sort of therapeutic intervention while on the psychedelic. And I'd say that combination of therapy and psychedelics, that's really where the magic is. That's where the science is. That's where we know, all the studies say at Johns Hopkins, for example, what's happening is that they're combining therapy with psychedelics. So psychedelics in and of themselves aren't necessarily going to transform CPTSD. Now, why is that? Why would I say that? And how would I know that? So let me give you a little context around that. So complex post-traumatic stress disorder is essentially, what happens is an effect, if you will, from what you could think of as, numerous, maybe hundreds, maybe thousands of small traumatic events that accumulate over time to create the effect of PTSD. So the problem is created not by a single instance of something shocking and dramatic or traumatic, but rather through repeated small traumas that kind of add up to create this kind of emotional scar tissue that creates this kind of, this response from the nervous system of PTSD. So if that's the case, assuming that that's the structure of how we got in the problem of CPTSD, then it stands to reason that it's going to take probably numerous passes, numerous interventions, numerous approaches to shifting it and reframing. And it's going to take some persistence and some consistency of working with one's own nervous system to undo that and shift that. So one big dramatic trip, or even a cluster of 4 or 5 really good trips, isn't necessarily going to have that same level of weight of a lifetime's worth of small persistent kind of traumas that have added up to create this effect. So there needs to be kind of a bit more diligence on the part of you if you want to be resolving your CPTSD. It's a mouthful, and I talk too fast on camera because I'm still nervous. I'm still getting used to YouTubing. It's going to take repeated, passes really to start to resolve it. That's what I found for myself. Now, I want to give you a little bit of background on me so that you understand where I'm coming from with this. As I said in the intro of the video, I'm someone who I didn't know I had CPTSD for a long time. I discovered that probably 5-6 years ago. And it explained everything. When I realized that that's what was the effect that I was dealing with and had been dealing with my whole life. And I realized that I knew I had childhood trauma, but I didn't realize I couldn't find one acute particular instance. And there was one event, one memory for me that I would kind of tend to return to, but even after working on it with all my NLP tools and all my hypnosis tools, I still had the nervous system response of CPTSD. And it wasn't until I really understood what CPTSD is and how it works and started reading about it and, watching, YouTube videos on it and podcasts and really getting deep on understanding the structure of it, I started to get a handle of it on myself. Now, leading up to that, I started taking psychedelics when I was a teenager. I'm in my mid-40s now. So pretty much from the time I was 20, shall we say, till, my late 30s, if you will, I was pretty involved in the festival world, in the psychedelics world, in the psychedelic community, in the therapy community, all of these kinds of areas, the new age community, spirituality community, that's kind of been my world, if you will. And so I have been working with psychedelics pretty proactively, pretty, regularly over that time. So that's a long stretch of time. And as you can imagine, that is a lot of psychedelic experiences. And I'm talking full dose, not microdose here. So I've done a lot of psychedelics. And at the end of that, 5 years ago, I still had CPTSD. And if I reflect back along all of my experiences throughout that whole time, studying different spiritual traditions, doing all kinds of yoga practices, learning different types of therapy, learning different types of psychology, what else? Going to festivals, having transformative experiences, out-of-body experiences, ego death experiences, you name it. I've been there, right? Even beyond all of that, I still had the traumatic symptoms. And to be perfectly frank with you, it's not 1,000% gone. I still have bits and pieces I'm working through, and it does take time and it does take work. But I've gotten a handle on most of it. And so what made the difference for me? Side note, in my community, in all the people I know and all the psychonauts and all the festivals and all the people I've seen doing tons of psychedelics and all the people I know in the psychedelic therapy world, even, a lot of them still carry trauma themselves, right? A lot of them still, it doesn't matter how many psychedelics they've done or how spiritual they are, how many breakthrough experiences they've had, they still come back down to the same way of being, and there's trauma there. And so you'll notice, with a lot of psychonauts, that it doesn't matter how, far they've kind of broken through, their foundation, their ground floor, their basic mode of being still carries trauma. And a lot of these people still deal with mental health issues. And this is one of the criticisms I have about the psychedelic kind of community. And it's one of the things I've been working to solve, and I'm about to share with you why I think that is. But I just want to make that point really clear. So so I had gone through this whole journey, done all these psychedelics, and worked on myself from, personal development perspectives and, spiritual perspectives, all this stuff. I'd gotten way the hell outside of my normal modes of consciousness frequently. And then once I understood CPTSD, I started to address it head on. Again, I'm talking too fast and I'm repeating myself. I started to address it head on, and I started to just do regular interventions instead of trying to do these grandiose kind of massive shifts in consciousness, just regular interventions every day. And that started to really clean it up. And what you'll notice if you look at any of the coaches who work in that space or any of the therapists that work in that space, this seems to be one of the kind of universal things about CPTSD, is that it just takes persistence, it takes time, and it takes really catching some low-level things. So I want to explain to you a bit about kind of one understanding. There's multiple ways of looking at CPTSD, but my understanding as a hypnotherapist, I want to explain to you what's happening. Why that would be that we could have these massive kind of brain resetting transformational experiences and then come back to our everyday waking consciousness and still be stuck with the anxiety or the depression. So basically, the short answer is that the psychedelic doesn't address the typical thought patterns that are at the heart of what holds the CPTSD in place. If you want to think about it like this, the normal way that we process the world every day is we think through a set of filters that we developed from our lived life experience. So we have literally a way that we sequence thoughts that's unique to each one of us, that creates a set of filters through which we think and perceive the world around us. So we see through these filters, we listen through these filters, we feel through these filters, we make sense through these filters, right? And while we're taking in life through these filters, we're also putting out our communication, in response to life through these filters as well. But generally, we don't track what the filters are or even that they exist. Generally speaking, as we're thinking and going about our day and feeling and processing, we assume that the filters are reality. We assume that our perception of reality is accurate and clear. But what happens for a person who's had some sort of PTSD, whether it's complex or acute, is that those filters, those perceptual filters of reality have kind of been, if you want to think about it, kind of molded or impacted or shaped or distorted, if you will, through those experiences. And so we end up with these distorted filters, and it's the distortions in the filters of thinking that hold the CPTSD or the post-traumatic stress disorder of any sort in place. And so what needs to change isn't necessarily going out and expanding your consciousness and resetting your brain and, all of that, because when you're doing that, you're so far outside of the filters that need to change that they don't even really necessarily apply. They're not what you're thinking through anymore. They're not what you're perceiving through anymore. And that in and of itself is a valuable lesson, to realize that as you shift your state, you shift your filters. As you shift your state, you shift your perception, and that shifts how you feel. That shifts what you see as possible. That shifts what you understand as true and real and valid, right? So that's a valuable lesson. That's an important key thing that psychedelics can teach all of us who dare to kind of step to them. But what I found happens over and over and over, what I found disappointing for myself is I would go beyond, right? I go beyond my conceptual framework into a new map, new model of reality. I'd have these amazing mystical experiences. I'd have transformative experiences. I would have bliss. I would have healings. I would have joy. I would have clarity. I would have wisdom. I would have cosmic insight downloads like you wouldn't believe, right? And then I would come back down, and yes, I would remember it. Obviously, I'd retain it. But as I kind of went back into my normal mode of being, the thought structures that I would think through would be the old ones, not the new ones. And so it kind of creates almost a two separate modes, if you will, of being that you start to discover, where you're like, oh, I can be in this expanded state and I can have all this freedom and all this well-being and all this peace and all these great states and all these great epiphanies, or I can kind of be in my normal humdrum, traumatized, way of being. And what happened for me in my case, and this is one of my, the problems I'm working to solve as a coach, is that I found that over time that became more and more disappointing, more and more distressing, more and more disheartening, more and more upsetting as I would touch these places of health and balance and clarity and well-being and spiritual alignment, strength, happiness, and all the states I would ever want to feel in myself, right? And I've touched places of high functioning in myself that are so desirable, right? And I'm sure you can probably relate. And then, I would come back down and I would not be functioning that way any longer. And the more that would happen, the more upsetting that became. And so part of the work that I'm looking to do is help people bridge that gap. And I do feel like I found some ways to bridge that gap. And so, but that's kind of a topic for a different video, how to do that, what that looks like, what I found works. But the point is that this is what happens with CPTSD. So if your baseline everyday lived experience is these filters that are distorted, and then you're moving beyond the filters instead of changing them, which is what psychedelics left alone by themselves will do, then you're not necessarily going to resolve the CPTSD. I hope that makes sense. Now, what we can do is we can obviously use those power states, those high vibrational, high consciousness modes of being to then inform how else you know how to be, and then rewire that back into the circuits and interrupt those filters and rewire them with these higher states of being. Another thing we can do is we can use these interventions while you're on the psychedelic, right? And then so you're open, you're fluid, you're neuroplastic, you're kind of more suggestible, if you will, more adaptable, if you will, and we can retrain the brain. So that's the kind of psychedelics plus therapy model versus just taking psychedelics by themselves. And so all of this is possible. But I want to just kind of make this video. I realize I'm kind of rambling here. I want to try and keep it to the point. The point is that in and of itself, it's not going to fix the CPTSD. So one question you might be asking is, well, okay, cool. I believe you. I get what you're saying, Dave. That's awesome. How long does it take? How much work is it going to take? And I would say it really depends on a lot of things, like, how severe is your traumatic response, right? Different people have different degrees of CPTSD. Some, it's to the point where they're really, really struggling and they can't function as a normal human being, in society the way they're expected to. For others of you, it's going to be, something more like something that's vexing you, something that's, a problem in your life, but you're still relatively stable, right? So it really depends on where you're at. It really depends on how persistent you are, because a lot of these interventions are things you want to be doing regularly. So not just when you're high, not just when you're on a psychedelic, not just when you're microdosing or whatever, but also when you're sober, also every day. So it really depends on how persistent you are. It depends on how much trauma you have. And sometimes what I found is that one type of intervention will work for a while, but it won't get you the whole way there. That for different, traumatic, memories or different distortions of the filter, that different interventions might be required. So you might need multiple therapists, or you might just need to learn multiple techniques in order to be able to start to really get at all of this content from different angles. So I hope that makes sense. I hope that clarifies that for you. So, I love all the enthusiasm around psychedelics. I love that there's passion for it. I love that there's a conversation emerging about it. I love what I see happening in that world, the science around it. It's all very hopeful, very optimistic, very beautiful. And I love the community. I love the people who are involved in this work and where their heads and hearts are at. I think it's really beautiful. And I'm also concerned. I also want to just offer this whole message I've just made here for you as a caveat, because I'm concerned that people are expecting too much, too quick. Understandably, anyone who's dealing with PTSD wants out of it ASAP. I get it. I get it. And it takes work. And it takes patience. And, how fast that can go, no one really knows. It's very much case dependent. But it is possible to heal it. It is possible to change it. And these are some of the ways that I found do work. But I want to be clear again that just taking psychedelics by themselves aren't necessarily going to be, the kind of silver bullet magic cure, if you will. This isn't just, pop a pill, trip out, and all of a sudden, problems go away. That's not, if that were the case, then obviously all the hippies from the 60s would all have, totally resolved all their issues. And, all the people in the 70s and 80s and the 90s and all the people who have done psychedelics would have resolved all their issues by now. And while I do think that there are a lot of mentally healthy people and a lot of better adjusted, more spiritually and emotionally aligned people maybe in the psychedelic community, there are clearly still a lot of people who have done a lot of psychedelics who haven't necessarily resolved or healed the past. So don't assume that just because you're taking a psychedelic that it's going to fix it for you. So anyways, that's my message in this video. Thanks for watching. Thanks for listening. I hope this provides some clarity and some insight for you. And if you got something out of this, please, comment below. Let me know, if this, hits home for you, if this resonates, if this makes sense. And let me know, if there's anything you want me to talk about, if there's any kind of topic or of interest that you want me to talk about. I'm still super shy as a YouTuber. I'm an introvert. I'm not used to being on camera. And I love doing this content, but I'm not getting a lot of responses or replies. So I don't know yet what it is that you want to see and you want to hear. So if there is something that you want to see or hear or explore, I'm happy to talk about it. Just let me know in the comments section below. And if you like the video, consider giving a thumbs up to let the algorithm know to serve it up to more people. And if you really like the content, please consider subscribing and being a part of this conversation, a part of this community. So much love, all the best to you, and I look forward to having more conversations with you. Thanks.